The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slid under the front door of the house my grandfather built with his own hands in 1961. It was addressed to me, not to the estate, not to the family trust. To me, by name, with a return address from a law firm I had never heard of. My Aunt Dolores had filed to remove me from the property within 48 hours of my father's funeral. She hadn't even waited for the flowers to wilt. I stood in the hallway reading it, still in my black dress, my daughter Lily pressed against my side asking if we could have cereal for breakfast. 8 years old, fresh grief on her face for a grandfather she had adored, and here was her grandmother's sister trying to put us on the street. I folded the letter in half. I put it in the kitchen drawer. I made the cereal. And then, after Lily fell asleep that night, I called my attorney. Some people in my family still think I went too far with what happened next. I want to tell you everything from the beginning, and then I want you to decide. Let me go back about 2 years because that is where the real story starts, even though it didn't feel like a story then. It felt like Tuesday. It felt like Thursday. It felt like the slow, grinding accumulation of being dismissed by people who should have known better. My name is Nora Scott. My father was Gerald Scott, a quiet man who spent 31 years working for the county assessor's office and every weekend of those years in his garage, restoring old furniture and drinking bad coffee. He was not a wealthy man in the way that people talk about wealth. He was wealthy in the way that matters more. He was consistent. He showed up. He remembered things. He called on birthdays. He kept his word. My Aunt Dolores Pereira is my father's younger sister, connected to him by blood and to me, therefore, by blood as well, though she has never acted like it. She married well, as the family phrase goes, meaning she married a man named Rodrigo Pereira, who made a significant amount of money in commercial real estate in the 90s and never let anyone in the family forget it. They live in a house with a circular driveway. This detail matters to Dolores in a way that I have never fully understood, but it explains a great deal about her behavior. Dolores has two sons. Their names are Brett and Cadden Pereira, and they are 26 and 23 respectively, and the sun rises and sets on them according to their mother's worldview. Brett manages one of Rodrigo's properties. Cadden is, at last report, considering his options. They are the family's heirs apparent in Dolores' reckoning, and they have been treated as such since birth. I have one child, Lily, my daughter. 8 years old as of last October, with her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and a laugh that makes strangers turn around in grocery stores just to see where it's coming from. Lily's father and I separated 3 years ago. It was mutual and it was civil, and it is not relevant to this story except to say that Lily has always been with me, and I have always been her person, and she has always been mine. My mother passed when I was 19. That is relevant because it meant that my father and I grew closer over the years in the particular way that happens when grief becomes the connective tissue between two people. We talked every Sunday. He came to every one of Lily's school events that his health permitted. He was the one who taught her to play checkers and who let her win exactly often enough that she never quite figured out he was doing it. The pattern with Dolores started long before my father got sick. It started, honestly, at my college graduation, when I was 22, and she pulled my father aside at the dinner afterward to suggest, within my earshot, that my degree in business administration was, quote, a bit general, wasn't it? And had I considered something more practical? She meant medical billing. She was very enthusiastic about medical billing. She had a friend whose daughter had gone into medical billing and was doing quite well, very stable, very sensible. My father looked at her with the particular patience he reserved for people who frustrated him and said, very calmly, that he thought Nora knew what she was doing. Then he changed the subject to baseball. That was his signature move, redirect to baseball. I have always loved him for it. I went into financial consulting. Not because Dolores suggested something else, but because numbers have always made sense to me in a way that people sometimes don't. I spent 3 years at a mid-size firm in the city, learning the machinery of other people's money, and then I went independent. I built my own practice slowly, carefully, the way my father built furniture. One piece at a time, no shortcuts, sand everything twice. By the time my father's health started declining, about 2 years before his death, I had a small but solid client base, a professional relationship with a financial planner named Gideon Akwu, who had been sending referrals my way for 18 months, and a business account that had stopped worrying me sometime around my 33rd birthday. I was not extravagant. I drove a sensible car. I lived in a comfortable house in a neighborhood where the schools were good and the neighbors were friendly. I did not advertise my income. I did not need to. Dolores, during this period, had developed a theory about me. The theory was that I was struggling. I do not know exactly where this theory originated, but I suspect it had something to do with the fact that I had declined twice to attend her annual New Year's party, which was a large and elaborate event held in the house with the circular driveway, and also with the fact that I drove a 4-year-old Subaru rather than something with a German logo. In Doller's taxonomy, these were indicators of financial distress. She began speaking to me with a particular softness that I recognized as pity and that I chose not to correct. Because here is the thing about people who underestimate you: they telegraph their moves. They tell you exactly what they think is happening and exactly what they think they can do. And if you're paying attention, you are never surprised. The first time she said something that made me want to respond and didn't, we were at my father's house on a Sunday in March, about 14 months before he died. He had just been diagnosed with the cardiac issue that would eventually take him, and the family had gathered informally, the way families do around bad news, with casseroles and too much coffee and everyone speaking slightly too loudly. Dolers had cornered me in the kitchen and told me, in a tone she clearly thought was kind, that if things got difficult financially, with Dad needing more care and all, she and Rodrigo would be happy to help. She would hate for Lily to go without anything important. I thanked her. I filled my coffee cup. I did not tell her that 6 days earlier I had finalized a contract with a regional manufacturing company that represented the largest single engagement of my career to that point. I simply smiled and asked if she wanted cream. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. Not weakness. Math. The second incident that mattered happened 4 months later, at my father's 68th birthday dinner. We were at a restaurant, the family gathered around a long table, and the conversation had turned to Lily's schooling. Lily was attending a small private school on a scholarship program for families in the county with strong academic standing, a program my father had helped me find and apply for 2 years earlier. It was a good program, and Lily was thriving. Dolers asked, with that particular smile that lives just north of polite, whether Lily would be staying at that school or whether I had thought about the public options in our district. Brett, who was sitting next to his mother, said something under his breath that I did not fully catch, but that made Cadden smirk. My father looked at me across the table. He knew. He always knew. I said Lily was doing wonderfully at her school and that we had no plans to change anything. Dolers nodded with the expression of someone who has decided not to push a point this time, but is filing it for later. My father redirected to baseball. I excused myself briefly, went to the restroom, and from there I sent a text to Gideon Akwu asking him to schedule a call that week about the college fund. I had been meaning to formalize the account structure and had been putting it off. That conversation with Dolers reminded me not to. Gideon and I talked 3 days later. By the end of the month, Lily had a dedicated education savings account with a balance at the time of $65,000, structured properly, growing quietly. I did not mention it to anyone. The third incident is the one I think about most, because it was the first time I understood that Dolers was not simply condescending. She was positioning. It was October, 13 months before my father died. He had updated his will earlier that year, in June, with his estate attorney, a man named Howard Takahashi, who had handled my father's documents for over a decade. I knew the will had been updated because my father told me. He did not tell me everything in it, which was his right, but he told me he had taken care of things the way he wanted them taken care of, and that Howard had helped him make it all very clear. In October, Dolers came to my father's house for what she called a practical conversation. I know this because my father told me about it afterward, with a kind of flat-voiced accuracy that told me he had not enjoyed it. She had apparently said, that he reconsider how the ring was handled. The gold signet ring that had belonged to his father and to his father's father before that. A family piece, simple and heavy, with a crest worn smooth by decades of use. She apparently said that it ought to go to one of the boys. It was a man's ring. It was a family heirloom. It should stay with the male line. My father had listened to her. He had offered her coffee. He had said he would think about it. And then he had called Howard Takahashi the following morning and made sure his wishes were documented in language that left nothing to interpretation. He called me that same afternoon and said, somewhat wryly, that he had had an interesting visit from his sister. I told him I had heard. He said not to worry. I told him I wasn't. He said good and then changed the subject to a furniture piece he was working on, a sideboard he was rebuilding from a water-damaged original, and we talked about wood grain for 20 minutes, and it was one of the best phone calls I can remember. I did not know then that it would be one of our last good ones before the decline started accelerating. But I stored it, the way you store things without knowing you're doing it. The sound of his voice. The unhurried way he described the grain of the wood. The way he said, before hanging up, that he was proud of me, just like that, unprompted, the way he sometimes did. That was the thing about my father. He didn't make you work for it. 13 months later, he was gone. And 3 days after we buried him, Dolores stood up at the family gathering at his house and announced that my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter who had spent the last year of her grandfather's life reading to him on Sunday afternoons and learning to play chess and bringing him drawings she made at school, could not inherit the ring. Only boys deserve family heirlooms. That is what she said, in a room full of people, with Lily sitting 6 feet away. I didn't argue, I stayed quiet. And I handed my daughter the letter from Howard Takahashi's office that had arrived 2 days before, which I had been carrying in my purse since then, waiting. Lily looked at the letter. She couldn't parse all the legal language, but she found the part that mattered, because I had put a small pencil mark next to it before folding it up. Her voice was very steady for an 8-year-old when she read it aloud. She stumbled on the word granddaughter, but she got it. She got all of it. To my granddaughter, $420,000 in the ring, because she has her great-grandmother's hands and she has always known what to do with them. Dolores' hand went to the base of her throat, not a dramatic gesture, just a reflex, the kind the body makes when the brain is trying to catch up. And then the eviction notice arrived. Now you understand the timeline. Now let me tell you what came before that and what I had quietly built while Dolores was busy positioning her sons. About 16 months before my father died, I had my first meeting with an estate and family law attorney named Claudine Mbeki. I found her through Howard Takahashi, who had mentioned, during a phone call about my father's updated documents, that if I ever had questions about my own situation, he had a colleague who specialized in exactly these kinds of multi-generational family matters. I wrote the name down. I waited 4 months before calling. Old habit, gather information, act deliberately, never in reaction. Claudine's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and she was the kind of attorney who listened with her entire body, leaning forward, hands still, nothing wasted. Our first meeting was in February, 2 years before my father's funeral, and it lasted 2 hours. What was discussed in that room has largely stayed in that room, as these things should. What I will tell you is that I left with a clear understanding of what my father's documented wishes meant for Lily's future, what the potential complications were, and what steps I could take quietly and legally to ensure that those complications were manageable. Claudine charged $600 an hour and was worth every cent. Over the following year, I made 5 additional visits to her office. Each one was scheduled around something that had shifted, a family comment here, a noticed behavior there, a legal question that emerged from watching Dolores watch my father. I did not tell my father I was doing this. It was not his burden to carry. He had enough. Gideon Akwu, my financial advisor, knew the broad strokes, not the family politics but the planning logic. He had helped me structure the education savings account, and had also, around the same time, helped me establish a secondary account in trust for Lily's healthcare needs. Because her pediatric specialist, Dr. Amara Singh at the children's clinic across town, had flagged that Lily might benefit from ongoing occupational therapy for a motor coordination issue caught during a routine evaluation. The therapy was twice a week, $60 a session with my insurance, and I had made sure that the coverage and funding for it were entirely independent of anything that could be disrupted by outside parties. I mention this because Dolores, at some point during those months, had made a comment to my father's neighbor, a woman named Greta Halst, who passed it back to me with evident discomfort, that she hoped Nora had good insurance for that little girl. The way she said it, the pause before little girl. Greta had felt it too, the shape of a threat not quite committed to. I texted Claudine that evening. She told me we were already covered on every relevant front. I thanked her. I went to Lily's school play the next morning and watched my daughter play a tree in the autumn pageant with total commitment and no self-consciousness whatsoever, and I thought, no one is touching this child's stability. Not while I have anything to say about it. The thing that kept my preparation private, through all of this, was something my father had understood intuitively that Dolores had never grasped. Information is leverage only when it is unexpected. The moment you reveal what you know, you lose the advantage. My father had kept his updated will private for the same reason. He told me the outcome. He did not tell me the details. He knew I didn't need them and that needing them would only make me anxious. I operated the same way with my own preparations. Claudine knew everything. Gideon knew the financial architecture. Howard Takahashi knew what he needed to know about the estate. No one else needed to know anything. Certainly not Dolores, who was very good at extracting information from situations and using it to work out how much room she had to maneuver. I gave her nothing to work with. Every time she fished, I smiled and gave her something small and harmless, the way you throw bread to a bird to keep it occupied while you eat your lunch in peace. The close call that almost unraveled everything happened at Thanksgiving, 8 months before my father's death. The whole family was at Dollar's house, the one with the circular driveway, 22 people around a table that could technically seat 16 if everyone agreed to be uncomfortable. Rodrigo was at the head of the table being expansive about the commercial real estate market. Brett was on his phone. Cadden had brought a girlfriend nobody had met before who looked like she would have preferred to be anywhere else. Lily was at the children's table with two of Brett's older kids, and I could hear her explaining the rules of chess with great patience and several errors. My father was having a good day, which meant he was sharp and a little tired, and mostly watching everything with the satisfied expression of a man who has lived long enough to find his family's chaos more amusing than distressing. Dolers had asked me, somewhere between the salad and the main course, about my business. Specifically, she had asked whether I was taking on new clients or whether things had slowed down a bit. The phrase a bit had a particular weight to it that I recognized. I told her things were steady. Consistent. You know how it is with consulting, it has its rhythms. She nodded with the expression of someone who knows something you don't, which in this case was entirely inverted from reality, and said that her friend's son had started a consulting practice and was finding it very competitive out there. Very competitive, she hoped I was keeping my overhead low. From across the table, my father's eyes found mine. He touched his ear, a small gesture. It was a private signal we had developed over the years for moments exactly like this, a reminder that I didn't have to answer. That silence was an option. I said I appreciated the thought, and then I asked Rodrigo about a commercial property development I had actually read about in the business section that week, one in which his firm was apparently not involved, and the conversation pivoted completely and never came back to me. After dinner, when Lily was helping clear dishes with the focused earnestness only an 8-year-old can bring to that task, Dolers came to stand next to me at the kitchen counter and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, that she just wanted me to know that if the estate needed to be simplified when the time came, she and Rodrigo were prepared to help manage things. Gerald trusted her. She understood what he would have wanted. I turned to look at her. She was looking at the dish Lily was carrying, tracking it with that small, pinched focus she gets when she is thinking several moves ahead. I said that Dad had always been very thorough about documenting his wishes, and that I had complete confidence Howard had everything exactly right. Doller's hand moved to her necklace. A small pearl strand she wore every time the family gathered. She always touched it when she was recalculating. She said, of course, of course. She moved back to the living room. I dried the dish Lily handed me and thought about Claudine's office, the stack of folders on the left side of her desk. The quiet certainty in her voice when she said the language in your father's documents is as clear as I've seen in 30 years of practice. Anyone who wants to contest it will have a very short and expensive journey. I had been building toward a specific moment for 14 months. Not the confrontation, I hadn't planned the confrontation. You can't plan those, they have a way of choosing their own timing. But the preparation behind it, the legal foundation, the financial structure, the documentation, the careful silence maintained across every family gathering where Dolers had probed and I had given nothing. All of it was in place. Howard Takahashi had sent me a copy of the relevant sections of the will, with my father's authorization, 3 weeks before my father died. He had called to tell me it was coming and to say, in his measured attorney's voice, that Gerald had been very deliberate in his language and that he wanted me to be fully informed before any family conversations took place. I had reviewed the documents with Claudine the following afternoon. We went through every clause. We identified every potential point of friction. We made sure I understood exactly what was protected, exactly what was not subject to contest, and exactly what Lily's position was in every scenario we could imagine. Everything I'd built was about to be tested in front of the entire family, and Dolers had no idea that she had already lost. The gathering after the funeral had a name in our family. We called it the reading, though it was never really that, not in the formal sense. It was more of a convergence, the kind that happens when someone dies and leaves behind a house full of objects and a family full of opinions about those objects. My father had been specific in his will. Howard Takahashi had made everything clear, documented, signed, witnessed, filed. There was nothing ambiguous. I knew this. Howard knew this. Claudine Embeke knew this. Dolers did not know that I knew. That distinction was everything. The gathering was on a Saturday, 11 days after my father's funeral, which had been held on a cold Thursday in late November. The date of the gathering was December 7th, and there were 14 people in my father's house, which still smelled like him, like coffee and wood shavings, and the particular dry warmth of a house kept by a man who never opened windows unless the weather specifically invited it. Lily was there. I had considered leaving her with a neighbor, and then I had decided against it, because she had loved her grandfather and she had a right to be in his house, and because I had a feeling, not quite a plan but something close to one, about how the afternoon might go. Brett and Cadden were there, both of them in the good jackets they wore when Rodrigo might be watching. Rodrigo himself sat in my father's armchair with the proprietary ease of a man who has already mentally rearranged the furniture. My father's neighbor Greta Halst had come, quietly and briefly, to pay her respects, and she sat near the kitchen doorway with a cup of tea and the watchful expression of someone who has attended enough of these gatherings to know what they actually are. My father's friend from the county assessor's office, a man named Vernon Chu who had worked alongside my father for 18 years, sat on the couch with his hands on his knees and said very little, which was consistent with everything I knew about Vernon. Dolers had organized the afternoon. This was, I had expected, inevitable. She had arranged sandwiches on a tray from a deli she liked, and she had printed a small agenda on a single sheet of paper, which she had left on the coffee table where everyone could see it. The agenda had 3 items: personal items, the property question, and next steps. She had not consulted me about the agenda. She had not consulted Howard, who was not present, having fulfilled his professional obligations at the funeral and left the family politics to the family. I had brought a folder. It was a plain manila folder, the kind you can buy anywhere, and I had set it on the side table next to the chair I chose, near the window, where the afternoon light came in at a low angle and made everything in the room look slightly more final than it was. Lily sat on the floor near my feet, quietly working through a small puzzle she had brought, the kind with large pieces, a map of the world in bright colors. She was very good at sitting still when she understood that the adults in the room needed space to do something. She had developed this skill in the last year of her grandfather's illness, during the long Sunday visits when conversation was slow and serious, and she had learned to find her own quiet within it. Dolers opened the afternoon by thanking everyone for coming, which landed in the room with the particular hollow sound of a formality that everyone present recognized as the beginning of something they had not been asked to consent to. She spoke briefly and with practiced warmth about my father, his character, his dedication to family. Brett nodded during this. Cadden looked at his phone and then put it away when Rodrigo shifted in the armchair. Then Dolers picked up the agenda sheet. I think we all want this to be as smooth as possible, she said, looking around the room in the way of someone who has already decided that smooth means what she wants it to mean. Gerald would have wanted that. Vernon Chu looked at his hands. Greta Halst took a sip of her tea. I said nothing. I kept my hands in my lap and watched. The first item went quickly. Personal items, some clothing my father had wanted to go to a specific charity, some books that had been pre-designated. Nobody disputed any of it. Dolers moved through the list with efficient confidence, checking items off the sheet with a pen she had brought. The second item was where she stopped, the property question. The house. She set the agenda sheet down. Gerald's house is obviously the most significant asset, and I think we all understand that decisions about it need to be made thoughtfully. Rodrigo straightened slightly in the armchair. Brett's attention sharpened. Howard has been very thorough, Dolers continued, and there was a particular emphasis on very that managed to be both complimentary and dismissive at once. But I think we can all agree that there's some flexibility in how the estate is administered. For instance, the question of occupancy while things are being settled. She looked at me then, directly for the first time. Nora, I know you and Lily have been spending time here, and that's completely understandable given the circumstances, but I think we need to be practical about the timeline. I let a full 2 seconds pass before I answered. What timeline would that be? Well, she glanced at Rodrigo, who gave her a small nod. Howard will begin the formal process, of course, but there are decisions about the property that really should involve the whole family. And given that the house represents the primary asset, it doesn't, I said, a pause. One of those pauses that changes the temperature of a room by a degree or two. Dolers blinked. Her hand moved toward her pearl necklace and stopped. I'm sorry, the house isn't the primary asset. My voice was completely level. I wasn't performing calm, I was calm. Howard can walk you through the full estate breakdown if you'd like to schedule a call with him, but the house isn't the largest item. Cadden looked up from where he'd been studying the middle distance. Brett turned his head toward his mother with a look I recognized, the look of a man waiting to be told how to feel about information. Dolers recovered quickly. She was good at that. Well, regardless, the point is that the family should discuss, Dolers. I picked up my folder, not opening it. Just picking it up. What was the third item on your agenda? Next steps? Let's get to that. She hesitated. In 20 years of watching Dolores Pereira operate in family rooms, I had never seen her hesitate. It lasted only a second, and then her confidence reassembled itself like water finding its level, and she leaned forward slightly and looked at me with a patience that was designed to look like kindness. Nora, I understand you're grieving. We all are. But I think it's important for the family to be aligned on what the will says. My tone stayed exactly where I wanted it, because I have a copy. Howard sent it to me 3 weeks before Dad died with Dad's full authorization. I've reviewed it very carefully. The room shifted. I felt it rather than saw it. Vernon Chu looked up from his hands. Greta Hulse set her teacup down with a care that meant she was paying full attention. Dolar's hand found her necklace this time. Her fingers closed around it. Well, there may be some aspects of the language that are open to interpretation. There aren't. I opened the folder. But let's talk about the ring first, since I think that's what you actually came here to discuss. And that was when she made the mistake that I had, on some level, been waiting for her to make for 14 months. She looked at Lily, my daughter, sitting on the floor with her puzzle, small and quiet and entirely unaware that she was being assessed. And Dolores looked at her with an expression that had nothing gentle in it, and said, in a voice that was loud enough for every person in the room to hear clearly, that she thought it needed to be said, since apparently nobody else was going to say it, that the ring should not go to Lily. That the ring was a man's ring. That it had passed through the male line of the Scott family for 3 generations. That only boys deserved family heirlooms of that kind. That it was tradition. That it was what Gerald would have truly wanted, whatever he might have written in a document drafted under difficult circumstances. She said all of this with the certainty of someone delivering an obvious truth to people who have simply not thought it through properly. Lily stopped moving, her hands stilled over the puzzle piece she'd been holding. She didn't look up right away, she just stopped. And something happened in me that was not anger exactly. Anger is hot and imprecise. This was colder and much more specific. It was the feeling of a door closing behind you. The decision I had been building toward for over a year finalized itself in the space of 3 seconds, and I understood that I was done being careful in the way I had been careful, done measuring and waiting, and holding the folder in my lap. Lily looked up at me. She had her grandfather's eyes. In them was a question she didn't know how to ask, the specific confusion of a child who has just heard an adult say something that doesn't make sense and is trying to figure out if she misunderstood. I looked back at her, and I held out my hand, and she got up from the floor and came to stand beside my chair. I have something I need you to look at, I told her. I reached into the folder and took out Howard's letter, the one that had arrived 2 days after the funeral, the one I had been carrying since then. I unfolded it. I found the marked paragraph. I handed it to her. Lily was 8 years old and she could read above her grade level, which was something her teacher had mentioned at every parent conference since first grade. She went through the letter slowly, the way she always approached new text, with her lips moving slightly and her finger tracing the line. She found the marked section. Her voice, when she read it aloud, was careful and a little halting in the way of a child reading formal language, but it was steady, completely steady. To my granddaughter, $420,000 and the ring, because she has her great-grandmother's hands and she has always known what to do with them. Nobody spoke. Dolar's fingers wrapped around the pearl necklace went completely white at the knuckle. Not a dramatic gesture, just physics. Brett opened his mouth. He didn't say anything. He looked at his mother, and she was looking at the letter in Lily's hands, and the look on her face was one I had not seen there before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't guilt. It was something more disorienting, the expression of a person who has been completely certain about something for a very long time and is only now being shown the exit. Cadden's chair creaked as he leaned back in it. Rodrigo said, very quietly, "Dollars." She let go of the necklace. I took the letter gently from Lily, kissed the top of her head, and asked her if she could go get herself a sandwich from the kitchen. She looked at me for a moment, doing the calculation children do when they're deciding whether they're being managed or genuinely asked, and then she nodded and went. I waited until she was out of the room. "If you are still with me," I said, looking at Dollars, "stay, because we have things to discuss." That afternoon, I stepped outside for 6 minutes, ostensibly to get air. I called Claudine Embeke from the front step of my father's house. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting my call. "File everything," I told her. "We're moving on the original timeline." A brief pause. "All of it? All of it." I heard the sound of her chair. "I'll have the initial filing done by Monday morning." I went back inside, I sat down, and I opened the folder the rest of the way. The confrontation that followed had a shape I had not planned but had, in some structural sense, prepared for. It built the way pressure builds, slowly at first, in small increments, and then all at once. I placed the first document on the coffee table. It was a single page, a summary from Howard Takahashi's office outlining the estate's primary components. The house, yes, at an assessed value of $340,000, but also a real estate investment property on the east side of the county that my father had purchased in 2007 and held quietly ever since, currently valued at $215,000, generating rental income that had been going directly into a dedicated account for 11 years. And a brokerage account, built slowly and without fanfare over 3 decades of disciplined county government saving, currently valued at just over $680,000. The ring was, in the accounting of this document, listed as a personal item of minimal appraised monetary value but significant sentimental value, bequeathed to his granddaughter. Dolers leaned forward and looked at the page. She read it the way a person reads something they don't want to be true, which is to say she read it twice and then looked up at me. Where is the investment property? Her voice had changed. Not dramatically, not yet, but the certainty was thinner, like fabric worn at the elbows. Eastbrook, the duplex on Merriman. Rodrigo made a sound that was not quite a word. Gerald never mentioned, Dolers stopped. He never mentioned a lot of things. I kept my voice even. He was a private person. You knew that? Brett shifted forward in his chair. Who gets the investment property? I looked at him. The trust, which administers to Lily until she's 25 through Howard's office. The expression on Brett's face went through three things quickly: confusion, recalculation, and then a kind of flatness that settled over his features like a shade being pulled. Dolers said, "A trust?" Not a question, a recitation. He set up a trust. Howard will walk you through the structure if you'd like. You can call his office Monday. She stopped. Her hand moved toward the necklace again and then stopped partway, as if she caught herself. When was this established? The trust? Formally, 14 months ago. I let that sit for exactly 1 second. Around the time you suggested to Dad that the ring should go to the boys. The thing about Rodrigo Pereira is that he was, despite everything, a businessman, and businessmen of his experience recognize the shape of a situation that has already concluded. I watched him look at his wife, and I watched the look that passed between them, and it told me more than anything either of them said. He knew, he'd possibly known for longer than she had. Vernon Chu looked at me from across the room. He cleared his throat. Gerald used to say Nora had her great-grandmother's hands, he said, to no one in particular. He said it a lot, the last couple of years especially. Nobody responded to this directly, but it changed something in the room's air. Greta Halst pressed her lips together in a way that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Dolers gathered herself. I could see her doing it, the deliberate reassembly of her composure, the way she straightened in her chair and reset her voice to its most reasonable register. Nora, I want you to understand that we are not trying to take anything away from Lily. But a trust administered by a law firm is a cold way for a child to inherit from her grandfather. Don't you think Gerald would have wanted something more personal? Something more within the family? He wrote the letter himself. I reached into the folder for the second document. This is his handwriting. He gave it to Howard to be included with the formal documents. It was a single index card, laminated at Howard's office on my father's request, his handwriting in the careful block letters he'd used his whole life. The sentences were short, in the way of a man who had always been economical with words. For Lily, the ring goes with her because she's a Scot, and that means something. Anyone who says different doesn't know what the name means. Dolers took the card when I held it out. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. The color started to leave her face in the uneven way of something that doesn't have a clear cause, not dramatic, not a single moment, just a slow draining that started at her temples and moved inward. Her mouth had a shape that was working toward speech and not finding it. Brett said, "Mom," quietly. She didn't respond. Cadden had fully put his phone away. He was watching his mother with an expression I had not expected from him, something between discomfort and a dawning recognition of something he hadn't wanted to see before. He said nothing, but he leaned back and crossed his arms in a way that was not defiant. It was the posture of someone removing themselves from a position they had been occupying by proximity. Rodrigo said her name again. Dolers. She set the card down on the coffee table in the center of the table where everyone could see it. I don't think she was making a deliberate choice about placement. I think her hands just stopped when they stopped. He wrote this, she said, not to me, to the room. He did. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than I'd heard it in the 30-some years I had known her. When? June, the same month he updated everything with Howard. He had Howard keep it. He wanted it formal. 4 seconds of silence. Real silence, not the performed kind, the kind that happens when people are genuinely adjusting to new geography. Greta Hulse set down her tea with a small ceramic sound that was the only noise in the room. He told me, Dolers said finally, still not quite to me. He said he was going to think about it when I came to see him in October. He said he would think about the ring. He had already updated everything in June, I said. He was being kind to you. She looked at me then. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, there was no agenda in the look. No positioning, no calculation, no assessment of what angle to work. Just a woman looking at her nephew's daughter across a coffee table with an index card between them, holding the fact that the man she had loved in her particular way had, very quietly and very deliberately, made a choice she had not anticipated and could not reverse. The humanizing moment with Dolores was not something I had expected, and I do not offer it as sentiment, only as truth. She reached out and touched the corner of the card with one finger very lightly and said, "He loved her, didn't he?" It was not a question. More than he could say. She pulled her hand back, and then she said, with the voice of someone conceding a position they have held for too long, "I sent a letter to Howard's office, 2 days after the funeral, requesting a review of the estate documents. I had known this. Claudine had known this within 12 hours of the letter's arrival, but I let her say it. I know, I said, a muscle in her jaw moved. And the eviction was filed by a law firm on your behalf, I said. Claudine has already responded. The filing will be withdrawn. Howard's documentation of the estate's occupancy provisions is sufficient to make that very clear. Rodrigo exhaled. It was the sound of a man who has just finished calculating something and does not like the result. Brett finally found his voice, though it had lost most of its earlier confidence. So Lily gets everything. The house, the trust, all of it? Not everything. The estate is structured as Howard and my father planned. There are provisions, but the house, yes, it transfers to the estate trust, which I administer as trustee on Lily's behalf until she's of age. You're the trustee. Brett repeated this the way people repeat things that don't match their expectations. Dad named me 18 months ago. Cadden made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Did you know all this? He asked his mother. Any of it? Dolores didn't answer him immediately. Her hand had gone to her lap. The necklace was alone. I knew Gerald had updated his will. I didn't know the specifics. But you sent the eviction notice before you knew the specifics. She looked at her younger son with something complex behind her eyes. I was trying to protect what was right. Cadden looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the index card on the table. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair, and walked to the kitchen. A minute later, I heard him speaking to Lily, his voice low, and Lily's voice answering, and the sound of the refrigerator opening. He did not come back to the sitting room for the rest of the afternoon. It was that, more than anything else, that completed the shift in the room. Dolores watched the kitchen doorway after her son disappeared through it, and something left her. Not just the argument, something else. The certainty, maybe, that she had been doing what the family wanted. She had looked to her son to confirm it, and he had walked away. The third document I placed on the table was a letter from Claudine's office outlining the formal response to the eviction filing, a summary of the legal basis for the estate's occupancy provisions, and a notice that if the original filing was not withdrawn within 5 business days, we would be pursuing costs and damages associated with a frivolous legal action filed against a property in active estate administration. Dolores did not read it all the way through. She picked it up, looked at the letterhead, and put it down. Rodrigo leaned forward in the armchair. His voice, when he spoke, had the level quality of a man who has pivoted away from a position without quite admitting the pivot. Who do we call to withdraw the filing? I wrote down the name of the law firm Claudine's office had identified. I slid the paper across the table. I did not say anything else about it. He took the paper. He folded it once. He put it in his jacket pocket and stood up. Dolores, he said, I think we're done here. She didn't move right away. She was looking at the index card again, my father's handwriting, the block letters. She looked at it for a long time, and then she stood up, and she was older when she stood than she had been when she sat down, in the specific way of people who have spent a great deal of energy holding a position and have just let it go. She looked at me. Her voice was quiet, not defeated exactly, something more private than defeat. He was always going to do it the way he did it. Yes, she nodded once. She picked up her purse. She walked to the kitchen doorway and looked in for a moment, at Cadden and Lily, who were sitting at my father's kitchen table eating sandwiches, and talking about something that made Lily tilt her head sideways the way she does when she finds something genuinely interesting. Dolores watched them for a moment. Then she left through the front door without saying anything else. Rodrigo followed her. Brett, after a brief pause during which he appeared to be deciding whether there was anything left to say, followed them both. He did not take a sandwich. Vernon Chu let out a slow breath. Gerald told me about a year ago that he'd taken care of things. He was looking at the index card. I didn't ask what he meant, I should have realized. He took care of everything, I said. Greta Hulst picked up her teacup and looked into it thoughtfully. He always did. Lily came back into the room with half a sandwich and sat down beside my chair and leaned against my arm. Is it done? She asked. The way children ask when they can feel that a long thing has finished. Yes, sweetheart, it's done. She picked up her puzzle piece from where she'd left it on the floor. Can we keep Grandpa's ring in my room? I looked at her. Wherever you want it. She thought about this seriously, the way she thinks about things that genuinely matter to her. Buy my books, she decided, so I can see it when I read. The eviction notice was formally withdrawn within 3 business days of that afternoon. Doller's law firm sent a one-sentence letter to Claudine's office stating that the matter had been resolved and the filing was withdrawn. No explanation, no apology. The brevity of it was, in its own way, informative. Claudine handled the rest. The estate administration proceeded through Howard's office on exactly the timeline and terms my father had specified. The investment property on Merriman was maintained under the trust, continuing to generate income. The brokerage account transferred into the trust structure. The education savings account I had built for Lily, now at $83,000, was consolidated with the trust's educational provisions. Dr. Amara Singh's occupational therapy program for Lily continued without interruption, now funded through the trust's healthcare provisions. The house, my father's house with the garage and the coffee smell, and the 31 years of accumulated quiet, became mine to manage on Lily's behalf. I did not move in. I live 3 miles away, in the house I have always lived in, where Lily does her homework at the kitchen table and Gideon Akwu sends me quarterly updates, and Claudine Mbeki is 2 phone calls away from anything that needs to be handled. Dolers and Rodrigo Pereira no longer attend family events. Not because anyone formally excluded them, but because there are no more large family events of the kind Dolers used to organize, the ones with the agenda sheets and the circular driveway and the implied hierarchy. The family has dispersed into its natural, smaller configurations. Vernon Chu still comes for dinner occasionally. Greta Halst brings tomatoes from her garden when they're in season. Cadden called me about 6 weeks after that Saturday. He asked if he could take Lily for ice cream sometime, just the two of them, because he felt like he'd been a lousy cousin once removed for most of her life, and he wanted to be less lousy. I said yes. He has taken her for ice cream twice. She likes him. He is trying. Brett has not called. Lily is 9 now. She is growing fast in the specific alarming way of children who were recently 8 and are clearly heading towards something larger than you have fully prepared for. She is in the advanced reading program at her school. She has finished her occupational therapy and graduated out of it with her therapist's enthusiastic sign-off, and she keeps her grandfather's ring on the shelf by her books, exactly where she said she would, between a collection of illustrated myths and a bird field guide she found at a used bookstore and immediately fell in love with. Last week she asked me if great-great-grandma's hands were like her hands. I said I thought so. She held her hands out and looked at them for a moment, turning them over, examining her own palms with scientific interest. Then she picked up her book and went back to reading. That was enough. That was everything. So I want to ask you something directly before you go. Doler still believes, as far as I know, that she was protecting tradition. She would tell you she was doing what any woman in her position would have done, protecting what she understood to be right. I have stopped spending energy on whether that is true. What I know is what my father knew, that some things belong to the people they are meant for, and no amount of agenda setting changes that. So you tell me, did I go too far, or not far enough? I genuinely want to know what you think.